The precipitation that evening was a fine, ethereal mist, making the atmosphere resemble polished crystal. The NATO facility rested on the city's periphery, a bastion of heavy concrete and reflective panels secured against the evening chill. Within its walls, bright light cascaded over a grand ballroom, where amusement echoed from the high ceiling, a festive gathering for the leaders who had successfully organized the new logistics division. Dignitaries, aides, and private partners mingled. Sparkling wine flowed. Decorations were shined sufficiently to dazzle. General Marcus Thorne positioned himself near the platform, posture rigid, tone slightly excessive. He was the sort of individual who dominated a space instinctively, each gesture calculated, every phrase crafted for maximum impact. His fourth star seemed newly affixed to his uniform. He possessed the wiry, unseatful energy of someone who had never faced a confrontation he had not initiated. Once the formal addresses concluded, the attendees relaxed. Servers navigated skillfully among the officers, offering trays of dark spirits. The musicians transitioned from a rigid march to a smooth jazz rhythm, and the evening's atmosphere began to truly vibrate. It was precisely then that the custodian made his entrance. Initially, he went unobserved. He entered discreetly using a secondary access, maneuvering a cleaning bucket, attired in gray work clothes that appeared 2 decades old. His posture was slightly stooped. His hair was white. He was the type of person who fades from memory, even while being directly observed. He commenced cleaning the marble floor near the doorway, addressing the damp tracks left by the rain. Thorne, however, did register his presence. He scowled, visibly annoyed that such a mundane element had intruded upon the perfect arrangement of his event. The presence of a custodian, a symbol of manual work, seemed discordant with the gleaming decorations, the pressed attire, and the pervasive mood of self-appreciation. Thorne called out across the expansive floor, his voice silencing the ambient conversation. He loudly questioned who had permitted maintenance staff to enter during an officer's formal reception. The room became silent. The elderly man paused his activity, the mop dripping water onto the polished tile. He raised his gaze, his eyes pale and unwavering. Thorne made a gesture, a slight smirk on his face, in the manner of those aware they have an audience. He commented that the old-timer had missed a spot. He then inquired about the man's clearance level, sarcastically asking if he intended to wipe the entire command structure clean that evening. A small number of officers laughed nervously. Someone quietly suggested that Thorne should disengage, but he did not. He seemed unable to. The custodian offered no reply. He retrieved a cloth from his pocket, carefully dried his hands, and resumed his task. This profound silence, the absolute lack of response, was what truly agitated Thorne. He advanced on the man. He stated firmly that he was speaking to him, his tone sharp enough to cut the air. He demanded to know if the man even understood his location. Incrementally, the old man stood to his full height. He observed Thorne for a significant duration, as if seeking a familiar feature in the general's expression. Then, still without speaking, he began to roll up his sleeve. Visible, though faint in the artificial light, was an insignia, a coiled serpent entwined around a sharp blade, its wings fully extended. The pigment had faded to a dull gray, yet its meticulous detail was undeniable. Professional work from a bygone era, applied by hand. The amusement in the room ceased abruptly. For a considerable pause, no one uttered a sound. A junior officer, a major from the intelligence division, lost his color. He whispered to Thorn, attempting to identify the emblem. Thorn interrupted him sharply, telling him to relax, insisting it was merely a tattoo. Yet it was clearly more, especially to those senior enough to recall the shadowed history of the long standoff. That particular symbol had not been public for many decades. Rumors suggested it was associated with a renounced special team, NATO shadow operations concealed beneath numerous aliases. Others dismissed it as mere legend. The custodian covered his arm once more and pivoted toward the exit, leaving a thin trail of moisture on the gleaming floor. Thorn demanded to know where the man believed he was going, his voice resonating throughout the large hall. The old man did not look back. He just replied, softly, that he had been there long before the general. He then moved into the hallway, the door closing after him with a noise that seemed definitive and absolute. Thorn remained immobile, his annoyance conflicting with a growing sense of disquiet. The whispering around him intensified. Officers exchanging pieces of memory, tales from past assignments, and referencing secret projects that were never discussed openly. When Thorn finally instructed someone to locate the custodian, the man had vanished. His equipment remained near the door, unattended. There was no identification, no log of his arrival. Externally, the rain had ceased. The streetlights cast reflections on the damp ground, resembling faded stars. At that juncture, General Marcus Thorn, a man convinced that every important piece of information had already crossed his desk, experienced the initial stirrings of uncertainty. He realized he had just taunted a phantom. The following morning, the facility was quiet once more, a stillness Thorn found unsettling. The aftermath of the celebration permeated the hallways. Discarded cups, loosened ties, and a lingering aroma of spirits the air system could not entirely erase. Beneath this, however, something else remained, a palpable tension. The specific kind that spreads through a secure location when speculation travels faster than official procedure. Thorn was seated at his desk, drumming a pen against the file that should not have been there. The custodian, lacking a name, an employment record, or a work assignment. The building's log indicated no one had entered between 1900 and 2300 hours. Despite this, 24 men had witnessed him in the ballroom. He knew he should have dismissed it. He should have attributed it to a simple administrative mistake, perhaps a transient worker hired through a third party. But the image of that tattoo, the serpent and the blade, kept repeating in his mind like a melody he could not silence. At 900, he summoned Major Keller from the intelligence section. Keller was youthful, lean, with an unnervingly sharp gaze. He held a folder bearing the NATO classification marking. Declassified, partial. Keller secured the door upon entering. He asked if the general had requested to see the file. Thorn gestured for him to be seated. He noted that Keller was the individual who had identified the tattoo the previous night. Keller paused, then confirmed this was correct. Thorn then instructed him to share everything he knew about it. The major sighed, massaging the back of his neck. He explained it originated from an old special delivery program during the tense era. It was known as Viper 1. It was active between 1963 and 1973, mostly in Southeast Asia. They had no official insignia and no permanent records. The participants were carriers, transporting data, sensitive information, and prototypes. They transported restricted atoms through dense wilderness before modern surveillance was available. Thorne looked concerned. He asked if NATO had utilized these individuals. Keller confirmed they had, but not officially. Most were sourced via the intelligence agency, operating under NATO's blessing. Their coordinator disappeared in 1974. The others simply dispersed. Thorne reclined, his annoyance shifting to skepticism. He questioned if Keller was truly suggesting the elderly custodian was part of that group. Keller could only shrug. He stated the tattoo's authenticity was high, and if it were genuine, that man had been undocumented for half a century. For the first time in many years, Thorne experienced a sensation he could not immediately identify: genuine apprehension. He dismissed Keller and remained by himself with the troubling idea. The clock on the wall seemed to tick with more volume than normal. On his desk, a photograph from the previous night's event looked back at him, Thorne beaming, holding a glass aloft. In the background, faintly perceptible in the glare from the glass doors, was the hazy outline of the custodian, observing. That evening, Thorne found sleep impossible. He returned to the headquarters, justifying the trip as a simple desire to check the security tapes. The personnel on duty were visibly surprised, but remained silent. It was not their place to challenge a four-star general's movements, even at midnight. Inside the monitoring room, Thorne navigated the recorded footage, his hands firm, but his jaw clenched. Sequentially, he observed the custodian's progress across the ballroom, propelling the bucket, standing near the attendees, stopping near the archive corridor. Suddenly, static filled the screen. The feed was interrupted for 10 seconds. When the picture returned, the custodian had vanished. Thorne leaned in, muttering in disbelief. The technician shook his head. He reported no outside interference, and the power supply had been constant. He explained that the camera signal was redirected internally from within the system itself. Thorne demanded to know by whom. The technician replied that it had to be someone with Level 4 authorization. Thorne gazed at the empty part of the monitor, an empty sensation growing in his stomach. He himself held Level 4 clearance. 3 other individuals on the base also held it. He produced a printed copy of a single frame, the custodian's face, captured just moments before the feed was lost. The man's eyes showed no fear. They were composed. They were aware. By the next day, Keller came back holding another file. He informed the general he had investigated further and had something he should review. He pushed an old photograph across the desk. It was monochrome, indistinct, and marked Saigon 1969. It showed 6 men in field attire, their features obscured by shadows. One of the men, though younger and thinner, was clearly the same person, possessing the same eyes and the same tranquil demeanor. Thorne asked for the name. Keller consulted his notes. He reported the registered pseudonym was Captain Aaron Vale. He was a carrier for the NATO Intelligence Division in the Southeast Asia Theater. His final documented assignment was Operation Glass Veil in April 1974. His status was listed as missing, presumed lost. Thorne remained motionless for a considerable time, focusing on the name. The office felt more restrictive, the atmosphere denser. He ordered Keller to retrieve everything related to Operation Glass Veil. Yet the file was non-existent. It was not on NATO systems. It was not in the agency archives. It was not even among the phantom records of declassified operations from the quiet conflict. It was as if an individual had deliberately erased the entire record. 2 evenings later, Thorne had an unexpected guest. The gate security informed him of a retired U.S. general asking for access without a prior arrangement. The name given was Wallace. Thorne recognized that name. Everyone did. Wallace was one of NATO's foundational architects from the long standoff, the person responsible for maintaining information flow in Europe when the continent was divided. He had, however, disappeared from public life after 1991, residing peacefully somewhere in Virginia. Wallace entered Thorne's office with an air of authority, as if he still commanded the space. Time had not made him gentle, it had merely worn him down. He wore no uniform, opting for a gray overcoat, and he possessed the gaze of someone who has witnessed too many hidden truths endure through too many conflicts. He addressed Thorne simply as Marcus, omitting any titles. He stated that Thorne had been investigating a matter that was meant to remain concealed. Thorne sat up straighter. He began to say that if Wallace was there regarding the custodian, Wallace confirmed he was. Wallace placed a small item on the desk, an aged keycard, its NATO emblem nearly worn away by time. He explained that the man's name was no longer Aaron Vale. He was one of the final carriers remaining. When the quiet conflict concluded, he opted for anonymity over recognition. Wallace asserted this was the sole reason they were both still present. Thorne frowned, his voice filled with skepticism. He asked if Wallace was claiming a custodian had rescued NATO. Wallace's demeanor remained unchanged. He replied that he was telling Thorne the man had transported high-yield contingency plans through the wilderness by himself in an era before satellite tracking. He had witnessed his whole team perish, all to prevent a global catastrophe, and today he cleaned the floors. The office became completely quiet. Wallace moved to the window. He observed that men like that do not vanish. They simply blend into the background where no one bothers to look. And when ignorant people ridicule them, history itself pays attention. Thorne felt a desire to rebut, but he found himself unable to speak. The self-assurance that had driven him for his entire career suddenly seemed insignificant and fragile. The sound of precipitation striking the glass filled the quiet. When Thorne next looked at his desk, the old keycard had vanished. Wallace was also gone. Only a subtle trace of rain and age remained in the air. In the hallway outside, the custodian's cleaning bucket was positioned quietly near the door once more, appearing as if it had been there all along. The following week went by in a haze. General Marcus Thorne, a person defined by structure and reason, found himself pacing the facility quietly. He examined corners, doorways, and vacant corridors, as if attempting to perceive what had previously been invisible. The custodian did not reappear. There were no access scans, no entries in the payroll. Nonetheless, every single morning the floors were immaculate. Spills were gone. Receptacles were empty. The distinct scent of cleaner hung in the air before sunrise. Someone, or some presence, was continuing the job. Thorne attempted to immerse himself in operational documents, but every line dissolved into meaninglessness, his thoughts returning compulsively to the one phrase Wallace had imparted: when ignorant people ridicule them, history pays attention. He slept very little. On the third night, the vivid dreams began. He visualized the custodian again, younger in this vision, navigating through dense tropical mist, a worn bag secured to his body. All around him there was heavy percussive noise. People were yelling in fragmented English and Vietnamese. The sound of aircraft blades cut the air rhythmically. This was followed by a brilliant, overwhelming flash of light, and then absolute quiet. Thorne awoke covered in perspiration, the phantom sound of the blades receding. He looked at the ceiling, his heart racing, and spoke the name that had been the subject of every hushed rumor since the party. Viper 1. By the time the sun rose, he had resolved his course of action. He summoned Major Keller to his office. The younger man appeared exhausted, shadows under his eyes, his uniform in slight disarray, as if the burden of their discovery had affected his rest. Thorne was direct. He stated they were going to determine the facts of Operation Glassveil. He added that if the information was concealed, they would persist until they found the truth. Keller paused. He respectfully pointed out that the operation remained classified by both U.S. and NATO intelligence bodies. It was extremely restricted. He warned that people had vanished for pursuing less sensitive matters. Thorne raised his head from his desk. He replied that they would, in that case, begin with the individuals who had not disappeared. He rose, took his coat, and signaled for Keller to accompany him. They traveled for 3 hours eastward into a remote part of Belgium, a peaceful agricultural area converted into a repository for NATO records that were officially gone. The structure was camouflaged as a silo, but its strengthened entrances and advanced security systems revealed its true purpose. Inside, particles of dust floated in beams of weak light. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of old paper and lubricant. A lone records keeper greeted them at the counter, a thin man with white hair and an indeterminate accent. Thorne stated they were searching for retired files, flashing his credentials. He specified early 1970s Southeast Asia activities under NATO intelligence oversight. The archivist blinked slowly, his expression neutral. He informed the general that such items were not available, even to current command, without specific written permission. Thorne leaned in closer. He told the man to write the authorization. The archivist observed him for a long duration, then silently stood and moved toward the rear of the facility. Thorne looked at Keller, who simply shrugged. When the archivist reappeared, he held one small unlabeled box secured with red wax. He placed it on the counter and said very quietly that they had not received it from him. Within the box, the documents were fragile and discolored, each marked confidential, NATO/agency joint. They included typed summaries, pale photographs, and pieces of communication logs. Keller arranged them on the table as Thorne began to read the contents aloud. He read that Operation Glassveil was established by a directive from Allied Command in 1969. Its goal was to intercept and retrieve Soviet high-yield targeting transmissions passing through Laos to Hanoi. The assets were 5 carriers using the designation Viper Mon. He advanced to the next page. The following line was typed in red. All members lost, except Courier 3, who was presumed detained. Thorne felt an icy sensation move up his back. Courier 3, the lone person to make it. A photograph fell from the folder, a hazy image of a young operative in field gear, partially facing the camera, rain obscuring his features. The text below identified him as Sea-Capt Aaron Vale, NATO Courier Division. Keller indicated the background of the image. He urged the general to look behind the main figure. In the indistinct distance, hardly discernible, was another person, an American general in uniform, conversing with an agency operative. The name visible on his uniform was Wallace. Thorne examined it for an extended period. He stated aloud that Wallace had been present. That evening, Thorne went back to the base by himself. He sat in his unlit office, the container of documents on his desk, the picture of Vale placed beside it. He prepared a glass of bourbon and looked at the image once more. An element of Vale's expression troubled him. It was not fear, nor was it resistance. It was something more serene, a form of acceptance. The wind caused the windows to vibrate. From somewhere down the corridor, a cleaning team's radio was faintly audible, interference and old music filtering through the building. And then, originating from the distant end of the hall, he registered it. The quiet sound of a mop bucket's wheels turning. He got to his feet. The noise gradually approached. When he pulled the door open, the hallway was vacant, except for the bucket, which sat immobile beneath the unsteady light. Resting on its edge was a folded envelope, completely dried despite the moist floor. Thorne took it. It contained one photograph. Saigon, 1974. A U.S. secure location. Forms covered by tops. And in the corner, General Wallace clasping hands with a man who was the identical image of the custodian. The reverse of the photo was marked with a date, April 4th, 1974. Below it, inscribed in blue ink, the final message was conveyed. Thorne collapsed into the closest chair, his heart racing. He hardly perceived the figure in the doorway until the person spoke. The voice said that the general had seen sufficient information. Thorne looked up abruptly. The custodian was standing there, wearing the same gray work clothes, possessing the same calm gaze. Thorne's hand moved involuntarily toward the telephone. He accused the man of illicitly entering his office. The old man denied it. He said no, he had simply been waiting. Thorne asked what he was waiting for. The man replied for Thorne to truly listen. He moved nearer, his footwear making almost no noise on the floor. At this proximity, Thorne could observe the time marked on his face, a lifetime of quiet, every line representing a confidence maintained. The custodian stated that Wallace had provided only half of the story. He had omitted the part that was truly important. Thorne remained silent. He was unable to speak. The old man looked at the open file on the desk, the images dispersed like shattered fragments. He said Thorne believed Viper 1 was a mission. It was not. It was, he explained, a solemn pact. Thorne asked what he meant. The man clarified. A promise, one made between countries and even between adversaries. They transported more than just maps. They transported discretion, the specific kind of discretion that prevents boundaries from erupting into conflict. He moved to the window, gazing into the damp darkness. He recounted how they were informed the world faced imminent catastrophe in 6 hours if the transmissions arrived in Moscow. So they moved quickly, through wilderness, through chaos, through profound loss. Only one individual emerged. Thorne swallowed hard. He identified the man as that survivor. The custodian turned, his gaze intense. He corrected Thorne. No, not him, not completely. He reached into his pocket and placed an object on the desk, an old NATO identification, corroded and warped. The name was difficult to read, but Thorne could decipher it. Wallace, Gr. Thorne looked up, stunned. He asked if Wallace had been lost there. The janitor affirmed it. He had perished protecting the carrier. The man Thorne knew as Wallace today. He was the replacement, the figure who took his place. For a lengthy period, Thorne could not stir. He could not process the information. The concept was too profound, too bizarre, that the individual who had visited his office was not the person he claimed to be. The custodian's tone became quieter. He explained this was why the records were erased. It was why he remained silent. The world, he said, could not withstand truths of that magnitude. He moved toward the door, but then stopped. He reminded Thorne he had wanted to know what history concealed. Now he knew. He advised him, using his first name, not to investigate anymore. The past, he warned, is not kind to the living. Before Thorne had a chance to respond, the man had vanished, absorbed by the hallway's faint illumination. Thorne remained immobile. The only audible noise, the quiet ticking of the clock. He reached for his drink again, but his hand was unsteady. Externally, the day was beginning, weak light filtering through the overcast sky, bathing the facility in gray. And from somewhere far away, carried softly on the damp air, was the spectral sound of helicopter blades. It was the start of winter when Thorne returned. Nobody was aware he had departed the facility. There were no official orders, no transfer, no separation. He was simply absent. Then, one day, his vehicle passed through the NATO gate once more. He wore the same attire, had the same composed look, but his gaze was altered. The hubris had vanished. The burden remained. He proceeded directly to the records office. Keller attempted to intercept him, mentioning there were reports, admonitions, and rumors from intelligence. He warned Thorne was under review for the unauthorized access of retired files. Thorne merely smiled. He remarked that no file was more valuable than a person's name. Then he closed the door. Inside, the archive's atmosphere was unchanged. Paper, dust, and quiet. On the desk sat the unlabeled box, the one from Belgium, the one that was supposed to have been destroyed. Thorne opened it with deliberation. Within, under the discolored folders, was a more compact envelope secured with wax. It had no writing, only an impression pressed into it, the serpent and the blade. He broke the wax seal. It contained a single cassette tape and a message written in pale ink. The note was addressed to whoever might find it. It instructed them to play the tape only one time. Then they were to destroy it. Thorne looked at the tape, its reels opaque with time. He located an old playback machine, inserted the cassette, and initiated the playback. Static was the first sound, like wind moving through dense foliage. Then a voice emerged, composed, quiet. It was Vale. The voice on the tape said that if someone was hearing this, it meant the world had endured. He explained he was not intended to return from Glass Vale. The map was not a physical object. It was internalized. They had embedded it in his mind. The coordinates, the access phrases, the emergency procedures. Every high-yield failsafe between Moscow and Washington. They had told him it would be lost when he was. But people like Wallace, the voice said, do not allow things to be lost. They conceal them while they are still active. The voice continued, saying they transported more than data. They transported the falsehood that resolution was ever simple. He gave them his silence so the conflict could stop. He hoped that one day someone might realize that quiet is not weakness, it is compassion. The voice concluded, "If you locate me, do not disturb me. Allow the custodian to continue his work." The tape mechanism clicked, and the sound stopped. Thorn remained seated for a significant time. The light overhead was unsteady, buzzing like the final remnant of a tempest. His image in the glass seemed more aged, more gaunt, possessed by another person's recollections. He spoke softly to the vacant room. He said that the man had carried silence so they could all live in the chaos. The atmosphere seemed denser afterward. Later that evening, Keller located him standing outside the facility, his coat collar raised, observing the falling snow. Keller suggested gently that the general had perhaps reviewed enough phantoms for one lifetime. Thorn did not respond immediately. He asked Keller if he knew the most difficult aspect of leadership. Keller admitted he did not. Thorn explained that it is the realization that the individuals who vanish are not the ones who were unsuccessful. They are the ones who were too successful. Keller moved, clearly uncomfortable. He asked if Thorn intended to file a report on any of this. Thorn looked at him, his expression impossible to decipher. He stated that there was nothing remaining to report. He moved away, deeper into the snow, until his form disappeared into the whiteness. 2 weeks later, the custodian reappeared. He arrived during the late hours once more, without announcement, without warning. There was just the quiet sound of a mop and the distant echo of an old melody in the hallway. Thorn located him near the remembrance wall, where metal plates listed every lost member since NATO's inception. He did not talk immediately. He just stood next to him, the light from the wall reflecting on the clean floor. Thorn finally spoke. He said the janitor had left him a message. The janitor offered a slight smile. He replied that he had left the truth. What Thorn did with that truth was his own concern. Thorn observed that the man had carried those codes within him. He could have brought about total ruin. The old man admitted he had come close, but the wilderness, he explained, has a method of teaching that staying alive is not the same as winning. Thorn nodded with understanding. He told the man he had heard the tape. The janitor replied that, in that case, Thorn understood. Thorn confirmed that he did. He paused, seeking the right words. He confessed that he had ridiculed him previously. He had dismissed him as insignificant, a remnant of the past. But, Thorn said, the man had been a crucial pivot point in history, and none of them had been aware of it. The custodian gazed at the wall. His image in the metal surface appeared younger, more defined. He stated that people like him were never intended for recognition. Their achievements spoil the instant they are articulated. Thorn swallowed. He suggested the man could have revealed himself. The janitor replied that he had. He had come forward every single day. He had been cleaning the floors. He had been taking out the refuse. He had been observing as the structure they built endured for one more day. A quiet moment passed between them. Thorn retrieved an item from his pocket and set it on the bench. It was the serpent and blade emblem, recently polished and mounted behind glass. He told the man it was for him. He said the very least they could do is remember. The custodian shook his head. He said no. It was for Thorn. It was so Thorn would remember the price of that silence. He slid the object back toward the general and turned to leave. As the man moved down the hallway, Thorn called out the name Vale. The old man paused, but did not turn around. He replied softly that his name was not Vale. Vale, he explained, was the person who was lost in that wilderness. He was merely what remained. He then vanished into the unlit portion of the corridor, consumed by shadow and space. When the sun came up over Brussels, the custodian had departed once more. His equipment was positioned tidily by the door, the mop clean and stored. On the counter, a message was written in a calm, firm hand. It said that history never rests. But occasionally it dreams. Thorn remained alone in the hallway. Externally, light passed through the glass, creating long white bands on the floor, resembling prison bars or, perhaps, clear pathways. He looked down at the framed symbol he was holding. The serpent was wrapped tightly around the blade, eternally. For the first time in his professional life, he offered a salute not to a flag, nor to a superior officer, nor to a symbol. He saluted only a memory. Then he proceeded out into the snow, allowing the doors to remain open in his wake. The snow was gone by spring. The city of Brussels resumed its rhythm, with its markets, its bicycles, and the quiet sound of people traveling to work. The NATO facility, with its transparent hallways and cold center, operated as if no disruption had occurred. Yet, in the early hours before the employees arrived, a quiet tune would occasionally float through the building, the same unhurried melody that had once accompanied the custodian's mop. Nobody could identify its source. Thorn was a changed man. He had moved out of his command position without ceremony, accepting a modest role in logistics, an administrative post with no awards and no media attention. Some speculated he was exhausted. Others suggested he had witnessed too much. He never offered a correction. His office was compact, located behind the storage hangars. On his wall, there was one framed picture, a mist-covered wilderness, the edges indistinct, the faces partly obscured. The caption beneath it said only 1974. Each morning he showed up before the sun. He prepared his own coffee. He walked the hallways by himself. And occasionally, as the first light touched the marble, he would see it, a faint, transient image, the reflection of an old man with a mop, moving in time with that same spectral melody. Thorn never mentioned this. He would just incline his head, a quiet acknowledgement of the past. One afternoon, several months later, Keller paid him a visit. The younger officer was now stationed in intelligence in Rome, but had passed through Brussels, as he put it, for a drink and a story. He located Thorn at his desk, examining an old file that lacked a cover. Keller asked if the general was still investigating phantoms. Thorn smiled slightly. He replied, no. He was just remembering who had concealed them. Keller found a chair. He asked if they had ever located him, the custodian. Thorn gazed out the window. Past the perimeter, the city glowed in the gentle light. He observed that some individuals are not supposed to be found. They are supposed to be recalled when one is not expecting it. Keller watched him for a second, then retrieved something from his coat and pushed it onto the desk, a small envelope stamped returned mail. Keller explained it had arrived via the intelligence mail service. It had no sending address, only Thorn's name. Thorn opened it with care. It contained one photograph. It showed a bright park, likely in Virginia. A bench beneath a willow tree. Seated on it was a man in gray work clothes, his white hair moving in the breeze. He was not looking toward the photographer. He was offering food to birds. On the reverse, a message was written in tidy script. No more codes, no more maps, just mornings. Thorn breathed out slowly. It was the type of exhalation that seems to hold an entire life. He put the photo into his jacket pocket and rose to his feet. He invited Keller to come along, suggesting they take a walk. They proceeded outdoors, the facility expansive beneath the clear sky. Unusually, the wind was not cold. Thorn paused by the remembrance wall. He cleared snow from one of the metal plates and then affixed a new one himself. It was small, blank, aside from one inscription. For those who carried silence. He then moved back, observing the light reflect off the surface. Keller looked at Thorn. He asked if the plate was for the custodian. Thorn shook his head. He said it was for all of them. He explained that they had constructed a world founded on that man's silence. The minimum they could do now was to acknowledge it. The younger man did not respond. He just nodded, his gaze tracking the pattern of light on the ground. For a significant pause, neither said anything. The facility around them was alive with activity, communications, vehicles, and conversation. And underlying all of it, quiet but persistent, was that same low melody. Thorn smiled, a very small smile. That evening, well after the facility's lights were extinguished, a solitary figure traversed the hallway. He had no identification, no title, no name. He was just a man with a mop, moving with a certain dignity. He stopped at the corridor's end, looking toward the remembrance wall. His gaze rested on the most recent edition. His image flickered on the polished surface, appearing younger, sharper, just for an instant. He murmured something inaudible, then pivoted and departed. The lights fluctuated one time. The hallway fell silent. Externally, the sun rose over Brussels, presenting the same pale gray sky as the day the world had chosen not to end. The custodian did not look behind him. He continued moving, his form dissolving into the new light, the sound of his steps merging with the quiet. And within that quiet, the truth persisted, unwavering, unseen, and everlasting. Because history never truly rests. It just bides its time, waiting for someone to recall.